Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the CRM MVP podcast. Today is a special episode because I am hosting with two of my favorite people in the whole world, my good friends, Joel and Neil. They are also Microsoft MVPs, and we are actually talking about a super interesting topic. Neil is essentially, the Scrum Master, right, of the bunch. He is the Scrum expert when it comes to methodology. We recorded a video together that you can find at crmmvpmedia.com talking about what's the best methodology for implementing Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform. So he is obviously a world-class expert when it comes to implementation methodology. And he reached out to me and Joel because he wanted to kind of understand how other organizations and other professionals work with solution architects when it comes to Scrum. More specifically, solution architects that have a specific set of skills that might not be needed throughout the whole project. Let's just use as an example a portal solution architect, right? You have someone who is an expert in portals. You may not need them for the whole duration of the 1 year long project or 6 month long project or whatever the project is. You may not need an expert in portals throughout the whole project. So he was kind of curious about how do we address that. For me specifically, I own Elevate Solutions and we implement Dynamics. We're a very small organization. Joel happens to work for Hitachi, which is a massive organization. So obviously we have very different perspectives and when solution architects will come into a project and how each organization kind of handles that. So I thought it was a great idea that Neil decided to invite us and kind of pick our brains in how we do it, how we actually bring in solution architects and work through it on the methodology. I think that probably the discussion started that way and it deviated into a bunch of different directions. Now, I'm going to go ahead and apologize up front for the bad quality of the audio from my perspective. I think the other guys sounded great, but I don't know why, for some reason, my microphone was not picked up. I actually picked up a different microphone that I use. Unfortunately, I have several in here, and the computer or the system that we used to record this episode picked up another one that was a little bit more distant. So you might struggle a little bit understanding what I'm saying. So I apologize in advance for that. However, I didn't want to skip the release of this episode just because the audio quality wasn't, up to par to what you guys are used to. I think that the content is great and kind of understanding the different perspectives. If you listen to the show, you know that I absolutely love to hear other people's experiences, best practices, especially if they're not the exact same ones that I have. Right? If I invite 10 people in here and we all think the exact same thing, I'm never going to learn. So I love to be involved in conversations where people have a completely different perspective, understand their reasoning, discuss back and forward. And I think that I can learn a lot more from that, right? I learn a lot from being exposed to different experiences and different methodologies and different people. So I really, really welcome the discussion with Neil and with Joel. And, we went back and forward. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this episode. This is a co-release with Scrum Dynamics and CRM Audio. So all of the three networks will be releasing the same episode. And if in case you're not subscribe to Scrum Dynamics or CRM Audio, I wanted to let Neil and Joel introduce the shows, and hopefully you get to subscribe right after this one. Once again, thank you for listening to this episode and subscribe to Scrum Dynamics and CRM Audio for more content about Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform.
Hi, this is Neil Benson, and I'm the host of the Scrum Dynamics podcast. The goal of the Scrum Dynamics podcast is to help Microsoft customers and partners have successful Microsoft business applications. I interview the people behind successful projects, including Fast Track recognized solution architects and Microsoft Partner of the Year award winners. And I also deliver solo shows about using Agile approaches such as Scrum to shrink your budgets, slash your delivery timelines, and have a lot more fun delivering applications that all your stakeholders will love. Find Scrum Dynamics on all major podcast players or visit customery.com for more.
Audio is a roundtable-style discussion podcast about Power Platform and Dynamics 365. Since 2015, George Dubinsky, Sean Tabor, and Joel Lindstrom have discussed the ever-changing world of Microsoft business applications. And let me tell you, it's changed a bunch since 2015. I think our first episode was about the OneNote integration with Dynamics CRM 2015. It's been fun because we come from different perspectives. Sean and I are architects working mainly on large enterprise projects, and George is a developer and ISV. You can find us at crm.audio or on any of the major podcast platforms.
All right. Thank you guys for the intro. I think it's time we start this show.
Joel and Gus, great to have you on a call together. It's been a long time since we caught up. I missed you at MVP Summit, guys. Where were you?
I was there. I don't know about the rest of you. I was there saving shows for you, and you never showed up.
Trying to avoid the coronavirus. Yeah, man. That was a huge disappointment. You know, the MVP Summit, just like you guys, is one of those things that I look forward to like all year. Going there, and you know, it's the one conference that normally we don't get to present, so you don't have to put together PowerPoint slides and demos and environments and all of that. Number one, and number two, you're surrounded by a few dozen people that essentially love to do exactly what you love to do, which is working with Dynamics and Power Platform and all of that. And a lot of us have a lot of similar hobbies and stuff. So even when you talk about non-technical stuff, you get to, you know, hang out with a bunch of people that do the same stuff you do. So I personally love it. And hopefully, fingers crossed, and they already announced that next year is going to be virtual as well. But hopefully,
at least we got next year.
Won't be, hopefully this won't be a permanent thing. Hopefully in 2022, we'll be back in person, but we'll see.
Right.
Yeah, I'm really missing it. I'm joining a lot of, you know, virtual summits and virtual conferences, and those are great. But the real reason I go to conferences is not for the content. You can get most of that on YouTube, even at MVP Summit. But you know, it's to meet the people, meet the folks who I interact every day with on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and email, and all the industry experts. So I'm really missing it. So good to have you.
It'll be
on a
back
call.
sometime.
Yeah. And listen, I could really do with your help. I've had a couple of questions from people who have got, you know, architect roles or job titles, and they're really struggling to know how they fit into Microsoft business applications projects. And I was recording a piece for one of my training programs, and I came up with this concept of having an intrinsic architect and an extrinsic architect in an agile project. So an intrinsic architect is somebody who's part of the team, is there every day, who's maybe got some design expertise, but isn't responsible for the design because the whole team is, but they're providing advice, they're giving guidance, they're maybe upskilling more junior people in the team, and they're really part of that team. Then there's an extrinsic architect who isn't full-time in the team, who maybe comes in for a couple of workshops, who's got some expertise in something the team doesn't know much about, and just participates briefly and then is gone again. And so I made this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic. But I'd love to get your take on, first of all, what do you think a solution architect is these days? What's our definition? Has that changed over the 10 years? And how do you see them being used in a traditional project versus a more agile approach? Love to get your thoughts.
I think that, you know, the main difference between me and Joel probably answering this question is that Joel works for a massive partner, right? And I have a small practice. I do implementations with a small team. So for me, a solution architect is someone who, in my opinion, is solely responsible for the success of the project. And what I mean by that is, for me, in order to implement an effective solution, that solution needs to be adopted by the users. It's always interesting when I get to talk to other solution architects and other people about whether your project was successful. And people tend to think that, well, if I do everything that is in my document design or functional design document or whatever, if I finish this checklist, then it's successful and we get paid. But if your solution is not adopted by users, that probably means that it doesn't provide any business value to them. So, I mean, as a solution architect, do you really do your job? I don't think so. So to me, being a solution architect is I'm responsible of delivering a solution that provides business value and the users will love working with it. So because of that, I think that I have to have a really broad level of knowledge, not just the technical knowledge, but also the knowledge about business, right? About what can I do with these business applications, which they don't necessarily have to be Microsoft. There's other tools out there as well, but how can they all work together in order to help this company get better at acquiring customers, at delivering the service those customers bought from them, and at keeping them, for life, essentially, extending that relationship. So I love the idea of extrinsic and intrinsic architects. I use them all the time if I'm in a project where I need, let's say, a portal. I'm not a portal expert, so I love to be able to bring someone who can help me out design that piece. Maybe that runs in its own epic, and that solution architect will be the main solution architect on that specific one. But when you think about the overall project, they are not involved from beginning to end. So I love that concept. I think it's really, really valuable. But I'm curious to hear what Joel thinks about what a solution architect is, because for me, it's a broader concept. But I know that when you work for a massive organization, there's all kinds of solution architects. There's pre-sales, there's, actual implementation solution architects. There's some that don't do any on the business side. Business analysts do that piece. So what do you think, Joel?
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Gus, and it really there's commonalities between big projects and small projects, and that I'll use the analogy of putting a puzzle together. That somebody use a great analogy that you got the different developers and consultants working on, say, the red pieces, the blue pieces, the green pieces. You need somebody who's seeing overall, making sure all the pieces fit together, and that's where I think the architect fits in, and that's where a couple of aspects of this I see it break down, and this would parallel if you look at fast track or the certifications like the MB400 versus the MB600. You've got the idea of the technical architect and then the solution architect, which is more the functional architect, more like what Gus was talking about. And the reality is that I think the idea of the self-organizing agile team is great, and I've been on some projects that have been near that. I don't know if anybody ever really reaches that fully, but the idea is in most projects you don't have all developers and consultants that are equal skill level. You've got junior resources, you've got senior resources. So part of that is making sure that the people like the consultants and developers are being effective and meshing together. And that's not necessarily project management, that's more just resource setting the resource schedule too, because you need somebody. If each person is involved in one area of the project, you need an overall release plan, and that's where the person best position for that is the architect. They should be the person that understands the whole process the best. They maybe don't go as deep into some areas, so
Right.
like, Gus, you used to work with Andy Popkin. I work with Andy Popkin now. He's much smarter than me in a lot of areas. But, there's things that he knows much deeper than I do. There's some things I know deeper than he does. And so that pairing of somebody who's more technical and somebody who's more functional is good. The other thing is a lot of times where you've got a mixture of skill and seniority levels, you need somebody who is the alpha for meetings. For when you have functionality reviews, you'll have the individual developers demoing their part, but you need to tie it together, a cohesive story. The project sponsor will want the one neck to choke. And sure, that might be your executive sponsor, but it's also on the delivery team. The the architect becomes kind of the face of that to the customer a lot of times. And that's where, again, I think what I try and do as an architect is empower the people on my team to be successful in doing what they're doing. I don't try and like micromanage or say you have to do it this way, but I do make sure we maintain consistent quality, make sure when we're creating things we follow good naming conventions, make sure that what we deliver will actually work. And that's, I think, the role of the architect, whether you're agile or whatever. But in some ways, a lot of aspects to me of the architect take on roles of the product owner from a functional standpoint.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that too. So the product owner has then got to have that business sense of what's needed and have that big picture perspective, and then help the development team to understand that. I've seen certainly my agile development teams, the Scrum development teams, both having development team members that have great design skills, and they're that person who can lead a workshop, be responsible for the design and take it on. But at the same time, they're working with architects who are outside the team. Maybe an enterprise architect who's responsible for a broader set of applications and standards and want to make sure everybody's using the right protocols for integration or the right documentation standards. Um, and and certainly in terms of documentation, I've seen solution architects to deliver much less documentation in an agile project than a traditional project. Gus, do you think that functional design document is necessary today?
I don't think so. I mean, I've never worked for a partner that is heavy in documentation to begin with. I think that if I had evolved my career on partners that are heavy into documentation, I would probably have a different opinion. I think that to me, there's a lot more value on making sure that the people within the customer side can understand what they have and own it after I'm done with the implementation, that spending time on a functional design document or documentation they can go back and read through it just to see what some type of functionality does and try to understand it. I mean, I've received documentation like that from customers that used to work for a partner that doesn't exist or that was acquired by another partner, and that company cannot work with them because there's a conflict of interest. It happens a lot with big organizations like RSM, or what happened with Sonoma Partners, for example, when they went to Ernst & Young. They had a lot of customers where they did like accounting and stuff like that, finance auditing, which that presents a conflict of interest, I guess, with the dynamic side. So they had to be sent somewhere else. So a lot of customers like that, when I get documentation is great, but at the same time, it's hard to understand if you don't have someone on the inside that understands what you have. So there I am trying to understand what is it, and in a lot of cases they have changed it along the way. So I'm trying to see what it is. It's like, oh yeah, we upgraded to UCI, but none of the documentation was updated. So in some cases, I think documentation is detrimental to understanding what you have, and in case you need to bring some of that external help.
Yeah, wow. I never thought of it that way, that it can be detrimental because it's so out of date. It misleads you to what the reality actually is.
I think there's a medium point, because when we went agile a few years ago, we went a vast string from the big. I had a design document that was 60 pages long, and then you go to, there's next to no documentation, but that carries its own problems, because there you don't have any proof of what you talked about at the beginning, and the customer might remember something, and the fact that it was in the architect's head but wasn't documented in any way can be a problem. So what we've gone to, and we're now a Fast Track Ready partner, so which a number of other partners are, it's not a Hitachi only thing, but basically we've adopted some of the things that Fast Track does, which one of these things is a blueprint, and so we're calling it a blueprint too, which isn't a big document, but it's certain artifacts like a high level entity relationship diagram, things like a diagram of the security model, those types of things that I would say artifacts that aren't specific to one story. Like, we'll have user stories and we'll have acceptance criteria, and if it's user functionality or user observable functionality, that's good, and that can be summarized in a document if people want to. But the artifacts around the design specifically of, this is the entity relationship diagram, this is what we agreed to for, I will make sometimes the DevOps wiki and do like decision points that, again, artifacts that we want to preserve, like this is what we decided to do about context sync filters. That way you got some documentation without being document heavy.
Yeah, I love that idea of the decisions, and that's what we do at the moment. We have a decision log. We're using Jira to manage all of that. So we create a Jira decision. We have different viewpoints weighing in on there, people adding comments. I think it should be A or B. Well, what about C? So that in a couple of months or a couple of years to come, you've not only got the system that shows you, this is what the design is, but you've got this decision register that says this is why. Because what, I look at something that Gus implemented a couple of years ago. I was like, what was he thinking? Well, now he's got a record of it.
Oh, you're not the only one. I look at stuff I implemented years ago, and I was like, what was I thinking when I did that? So it happens for sure.
And it's amazing with the rapid pace of change. You get to the end of a project and somebody says, why didn't you tell me about this earlier? It wasn't there earlier. We're using the custom help pane now. When we sold it to you, that didn't even exist. So now, you you just got to ship. But again, documenting what you know. And I would say too, it's different depending on how big the project is. So that blueprint for, say a 3-week Power App project is going to be probably an ERD and maybe 1 or 2 wireframes of a mobile screen.
Right.
Where something like a typical sales, customer service, or especially field service is going to be bigger than that just because of the complexity is bigger. So we try and scale that based on where we are. And we're trying to, have a similar framework for both, at least a framework that's the same across F&O, what we used to call CE, Azure projects, et cetera. But the reality is they actually look different, but they have similar components in it that way. So if somebody moves between, or some projects, if they have both F&O and CE and together in the same project, they don't get vastly different deliverables.
So you're taking an agile approach, but you're doing a little bit of upfront design, upfront documentation. Where do you find that sweet spot between a little to keep you going and give you that big picture, and too much that you end up designing something that's quite rigid whenever you actually know very little about the requirements at the outset of a project?
That's the same thing I was thinking, that, how can you put together documentation in some cases when you haven't even engaged with the relevant, I guess, decision makers on a specific team that will be the one dictating how the functionality is going to look like. Now, some of the information before you get started because there was a contract that was signed and there was some agreement in place on what is it that you were going to be implementing. But in a lot of cases, the details and the way the workflow happens doesn't come until later. So it's pretty tough. I mean, one thing that I found is that we're pretty flexible with things like documentation. Depending on whether the customer wants more or less detail, we'll escalate. We'll move. I mean, I think that that's one thing that I kind of put it up to the customer. It's the same with training. Like even though I love training, I love talking about dynamics, I don't offer myself to lead the training every time. I always tell the customer, look, I think that it would make more sense if it comes from you, not only that you will be able to provide real life examples that I cannot come up with. Like, you'll know exactly what customer, what situation, they'll know exactly what to say. Whereas I'm not going to be able to do that stuff. But at the same time, in the future, as you hire more people, it will be great for someone to be able to train those people as well. So I'll support you. I'll help you put together the training documentation. We'll talk about how many sessions are worth it, how long, how would I tackle it. But I would prefer if you actually run it. But in some cases, customers are like, no, you need to do it. Okay, cool, I'll do it. I love training. I have no issue with that. So documentation is one of those things where, depending on the customer, and in some cases, our customers have even taken it upon themselves. We have a customer right now who went to the UG Summit and actually stopped by the Click Learn booth, and they fell in love with it. They were like, this thing is awesome. We're signing up immediately. And they use it heavily. Like, they have hundreds of pages worth of documentation and screenshots and stuff like that. They absolutely love it. They're using their online school that they have. ClickLearn has like an online learning system. They're all over that. So it typically changes from project to project. We don't have a default set. I think that if we were talking about the way we like to implement Dynamics, we do have one way that we like to do it, and we don't switch that for customers. But when it comes to things like documentation, training, some of these external things that are also important for projects, we're still a little bit more flexible in those things.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, ClickLearn, that's great for things like training materials too. So you're not just creating dusty training materials. And I'm a fan of ClickLearn because it lets you easily update the screenshots without rebuilding everything. But as far as the documentation from the design, what I like to do is capture the blueprint, like the ERD and that level of documentation after the workshop when we have the user stories, along with putting them in DevOps. And then what I like to do is, as we have in each story, the design for that story, some time for design, develop, and test within that, updating the documentation as part of each story. So if I'm working on the account entity and I'm adding 5 fields, I go to the wiki and I add 5 fields to that. If I add a new entity, fortunately, we got the XRM toolbox and the ERD generation tool and this is UML tool and things like that make it super easy to just update a new diagram. And that kind of diagram, like the ERD, is very helpful, I found, even for people testing the story, because they want to know how the data relates to each other. So we're not building this big documentation where we have somebody just doing a 80-hour documentation task. We're spreading the documentation and the updating of the documentation throughout the sprints and the stories, so that as we deliver it, we can keep that documentation up to date. And then at the end, if we just need to generate a new ERD, we can do that.
I'm curious to hear, Joel, from you as well. And I think this is what we talked about when we started this episode about the internal, external solution architects, or intrinsic, extrinsic. I think you call them now. How do you guys deal with that at Hitachi? Do you have the same team like from beginning to end in a project, or are you guys more like people coming in and out depending on where you are at a stage and what's needed?
So I can't talk for all architects because every project is different, but a lot of times the architect, well, we keep the architect involved throughout the project, but the reality is there's less architecting that needs to happen as you get towards the end of the project. It just is. And you've got maybe some developers developing some integrations, and you want to keep the architect. I found it's bad news if the architect is not involved, because the architect is a key factor for the project staying on the rails and not going outside of scope. Because again, if you have all people who maybe are specialists in individual areas, you'll see scope creep and things that we are great to do. And coming in through the agile process, you need somebody to be the referee that says politely, yes, we can do that, but that's going to require more budget and maybe more time. So that's where again, you want somebody to have enough skin in the game throughout the project. But the reality is, if we're not designing anything, if we're coming up to the end and we're squashing bugs and other things like that, from a budgetary perspective, the customers a lot of times aren't going to want to have a 40-hour week architect, but you want to keep them enough involved so that they can still stay interested and stay in charge of the direction of the project and raise a flag if it's going the wrong way. And also, that's a lot of times where you're doing the in-depth knowledge transfer. We do knowledge transfer throughout the project, but you really get serious about it towards the end, because that's when the admins realize, hey, I'm going to have to manage these environments and things like that.
For sure. And Neil, for you, it seems like you've been doing this for a while, bringing intrinsic and extrinsic architects in. The thing that I believe that scares me the most about doing this, and not doing it like for a whole face, like when I do portals or when I do an integration or something like that, is the planning of the utilization of resources, right? How do you plan to bring someone, let's say 3 months into a project, but then maybe something gets done faster and you can bring them in early, or it delays, like the data migration always, it's hard to predict when it's going to end, because there's always issues and stuff, and you needed someone after the data was in the system. How do you deal with resource utilization then when you need to bring people from the outside that might be involved in other projects? They might be used in multiple projects and not involved in just one. How do you plan for that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gus. And my experience has varied over my last two big enterprise projects, which are both multiple teams, multiple years, a big client where I'm deeply entrenched. One was with a big Microsoft partner. And so when I think about the additional resources we had to bring in, most of those resources were under my control. I was the practice manager, and we had the on site Scrum team, but then I could bring in additional resources with expertise as and when I needed them. And it was up to me to manage that schedule, pull them off another project for a week or two or a day or two, and release them back again. And so I was always juggling that. Contrast that with my more recent experience over the last couple of years with one client, and we're just a bunch of freelance consultants. So we don't have a pool of talent inside our consulting organization. Where I need to pull people in is probably from the client organization or other third-party vendors, right? Somebody with experience in the Experian data quality solution. So I'll call Experian and try and pull some of their guys in. So it's working with third parties or internal IT experts. It's just a juggling game, man. It's part of the wonderful fun that we have as managing a practice. You don't always get it right. You don't always get the resource, the right resource at the right time, but you just got to make do with what you can get.
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of that guy that I will be the intrinsic one on the project team, but I get pulled in as a resource on a lot of our projects for a single meeting or a series for dedicated to a specific point, like ALM, or dedicated towards, something where maybe I'm filling a gap on the project. And to me, the way you do that is you equip that person with enough knowledge. But in some ways, you can use that to your advantage, because sometimes there's things politically that you, as the intrinsic or the person on the team, can't say without ruffling feathers. But if you bring in Neil, who's the expert, kind of like what you do with Scrum, Neil, you can say things and say them tactfully, but in a way that's hard truth, that if somebody on the team said, hey, you were doing it wrong, they would do that. And that's where, again, I think you can use that to your advantage, as long as they stay in your lane. To me, it's fun because I don't carry the ongoing responsibility of ensuring the project, but I can help make the project better.
Yeah.
And I would say one other factor that I think good architects do is grow people on the project team, because in some larger environments, you can have a stay in your lane mentality. You do this is all you do, and they never have a chance to go outside that. Where a good architect will give junior resources on the project opportunities to lead meetings, to lead discovery. Hey, this thing about the Outlook client we're doing, why don't you lead that? I'll be there if you need me, and help build the skill and the confidence. And I wouldn't be an architect today if people hadn't done that for me. So
Of course.
I always want the people I work with on my projects to be better than they were before that, and be able to, because the reality is, in this world that we live in, consultants a lot of times want to move up. Most people do. I've met a few that don't. They love what they do, and that's great. They don't want any other responsibility. They get fulfillment for other parts of their lives. But for most people in a practice anyway, they want to advance in their careers. And so that's where, good architect isn't the dictator that says my way the highway, and doesn't take, because I've got examples where we have junior associate consultants that were brought in, great people, great work ethic. They're learning, some of them are learning very quickly, but I've learned things from them, such as, I didn't know 6 months ago we had the auto number field in Dynamics.
Do
And
what?
the auto number data type, it just surprised me. I missed it when it came out, and I was suggesting the old
Man.
fashioned way of doing it. And then they said, well, what's this thing called auto number? I said, you're crazy. I mean,
They
you
must
got,
have had that this morning, right?
yeah, that was bad yesterday.
That's like when I
So,
found out the whole file system, and I posted it on, to the MVPs. I'm like, have you guys seen this? And they're like, yeah, it's been there for like 6 months. And I'm like, what? I haven't even seen this file, data type. But, going back to the conversation we were having, what happens to me a lot is that, like you, Neil, I partner with other freelancers and stuff. And sometimes we've even, looked at a prospect together and agreed on an approach and to work together in an implementation. But then the prospect took a couple months to secure funding or whatever it is, or resources. And when they come back and said, okay, let's go ahead and do it, then that other person I have worked with and maybe even visited the prospect, with, it's no longer available. Or, it happened to me, a prospect said, I think we met, we went to visit them. I went with a freelancer, which you guys know, but I went with a freelancer. We looked at their system. Okay, this is the project. We're good to go. We can start as soon as you can. And then it took them about 2 or 3 months to get started. And around November, they went back and said, I think we went around June there. In November, they came and said, okay, we're ready to do it. When can you guys start? I reached out to, my other freelancer, and I was like, can you start? And they said, no, I'm booked till March. So now I have to scramble to look to see who with similar, skills is able to deliver that project with me, or maybe have oversight, not a full, investment of time from the other freelancer, but can you oversight while this other team is delivering, because they are available to do it. So it's interesting when you look at it that way. Now, I do want to bring something interesting. I don't know if this happened to you. Hopefully it has, because I want to hear the story. But has it ever happened that when you bring in a resource, it doesn't have to be a solution architect. It can be anybody, project manager, developer, it doesn't matter. But has it ever happened that when they come into one of those meetings or whatever it is, just to help out in a project, they have mentioned something that they shouldn't have said, or maybe you didn't know, but they derail something. And I'll tell you a story that I heard recently from my best friend. He worked for a massive company. I won't say the name, but he worked for a massive company. He was brought in into a project for a bank. And when he came in, and he's like the worldwide expert in virtualization technology, especially from Citrix. He used to work for Citrix. The guy is legit. So he was brought in, and they were talking about this cloud solution with Citrix or whatever. And they asked him, okay, so what's your opinion on this? And he's like, oh, no, this is totally gonna work as long as you guys have enough storage for all these, stuff that you're trying to host. Let's just put it that way. And they're like, what are you talking about? He's like, oh, you're going to need like 40 terabytes to host all this stuff. And no one had mentioned that. The project was already signed for. Contracts had been signed for. Everything was ongoing. And then they realized they have to make an investment of like whatever petabytes. It was a huge thing. It was a huge investment by this bank. And it went south very, very quick. At that point, he brought that up. No one in the project knew that. Like the other architects didn't know it was that bad. But he just made that comment, and now the whole project is, there is some frustration from the customer, let's just say. And I think that's still ongoing, because I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, and that was still ongoing. So has anything happened to you guys like that? That someone came in and said something, and can you share that story?
I'm trying to remember. I'm sure it's happened to me. I can't. But yeah, I think that's why I always try and get enough information. Or if I do have a situation where I'm brought in to give recommendations, I would try to bounce those off of the product team first. I do get a little miffed when I bring something up, Power Apps or whatever, and they say, "Oh no, we can't tell anybody about that," because that's just crazy, because that's the way technology is going, and you're just deluding yourself to think like, "Oh, we shouldn't bring up this new capacity storage that's happening next month," or whatever, because you're just sticking your head in the sand. But realistically, might be there's something new that would do a better job, but they can't do it yet. So I would say, yeah, that is a risk. Bigger risk to me is the too many cooks issue, where this is where, if you ever have two or more architects on your project, you need to watch out, because I always joke with Scott Sewell that the reason I still get along with him is because we never had to work on the same project. The three of us were on the same project, or somebody said we should start MVP Incorporated, where all these independent MVPs just work together. And the reality is, many of us would hate each other because we're used to being the sheriff. And what I've found is, if I'm ever on a project, and I've learned this because I've had architects I've been on a project with who kind of ruined the relationship a little bit, because we would come to the same conclusion but have different ways of getting there. And so I always say, let's set expectations. Let's say, who's doing what, who's in charge of what. We can all be here. We can't all be in charge of the same thing. And if we do, we'll butt heads. You do field service, I'll do sales. That's great, whatever. But we can't all be there, because we'll be constantly, we'll constantly be questioning each other's decisions, and
Yeah, one interesting one that happened to me recently was, I'm doing the CRM portion of this project that is ERP and CRM. They're using another partner for the ERP side. Obviously, I don't do that. So we were talking about the integration between the two. And my idea was to use Kingsway Soft, which I've seen integrated with that ERP platform a million times, and it works very well. So because the CRM portion started working months before the ERP portion, I started telling the customer that, hey, I think Kingsway Soft will be this. If you ask me my recommendation, I would recommend Kingsway Soft. But if you guys are using some integration technology already, just use whatever you have. They're like, no, we're not using anything, so we'll go with Kingsway Soft. Cool. Then this partner came in, and they recommended Smart Connect. Like on a meeting that I wasn't involved, right? They brought it up again. They started talking about ERP, and they said, these two have to be integrated. So the partner is like, Smart Connect, hands down. We have to do Smart Connect, right? The partners started saying that. But the funny thing is, they just had hired an MVP actually pretty recently, and the guy was coming to like the project. That was going to be his first project. And like in meeting number 2, the guy comes in, and they're talking about the integration again after they set Smart Connect, and I had set Kingsway Soft, and the guy's like, Flow all day. We got to use Flow. So now it's like, 3 different opinions on how this stuff gets done, and the partner is kind of in the middle.
I'll
what
call
are we
them
doing?
jewelry.
Like, which one are we using? So anyway, that was pretty funny because again, you're getting people coming in and throwing that curveball in the middle of it, and everyone is confused.
But it's no different than if you're working with Fast Track on your project. You want to talk to them first, set expectations so you don't step on each other's toes. Then that usually goes well. It's when you don't have that conversation that you can say something they don't agree with, or they can. But if you can talk to them first, say, "Here's what we're doing, and here's why we're doing it. What do you think?" and be open to that, then it's usually a harmonious experience.
I had some interesting stories working with Leon Tribe and Elena Grishenko, both from Sydney when we all three of us worked together. Both much better architects than I am. Leon, much more of a functional background, so a great solution architect. Elena is technically gifted, a great technical architect. And Leon, has a good sense of business and a good said bedside manner, I'd say. So he knows which buttons to push for the client and how to bring them along on a journey. Elena just calls it like she sees it every time. Very honest, very upfront, very Ukrainian, and yeah, that led to some interesting fireworks in the middle of some of our workshops. Sometimes, I have fond memories working with those two. Not we didn't always agree on what the right solution was, whether it's going to be Kingsway Soft or Flow for integration. It's never Flow, by the way. So yeah, some interesting debates in some of our meetings.
Right. And I think one of the interesting things now that we're all going through is what's the role of the architect in Power Platform deployments that aren't full dynamics? And it is different. I still haven't come to the full answer with that. It's still needed, but it's just a little bit different. I find where a lot of Power Apps you'll have a single developer developing one app. You might have 4 apps and have 2 or 3 developers, but still I think the need for design is there, the need for best practices, the need for security when it comes to CDS, the governance. And a lot of times the architect is the closest conduit to the admin and most well positioned to train the admin on being admin, because if they understand their environment enough to work in their project and design the solution, I can transfer knowledge about how to do the care and feeding for it probably better than anybody
Right.
else on the project.
And I think it's part because a lot of us used to be admins. Like for me, I was a CRM administrator for CRM 3.0 before I actually moved into being a whatever. I went to support side or technical lead, and then I made it to functional consultant and so on. So a lot of us came from that background. So it's like you said, I do think as well that the architects are really in a really good position to train admins.
Talking about the skills that architects need, Joel, you alluded there that a Power Platform architect's skills need to be slightly different than in what I would consider, a Dynamics 365 architect, where I never had to worry about the user interface too much. Model apps are very constrained in what you can do. You can introduce web resources and PCF controls now, but with Canvas apps, you literally have a blank canvas and you can design the app to look however you want it to look. Architects coming from a Dynamics 365 background very rarely have any kind of UX or UI design skills. Do you see that changing? Are we going to have to, as architects, are we going to have to learn those skills? Are we going to have to hire and promote more people with a UI design skill set?
I think
How's that changing?
Yeah, I think it is something that we need to pay more attention to, and an architect that is coming from the dynamics background, but I think unified interface as well, because we've seen some terrible user experiences. And I was going through an upgrade recently that literally their icons were a history of dynamics from 2011 to 365, because they'd gone through each upgrade and had an icon left from each. So you had some of the Fisher Price 2011 icons, some of the 2013 ones, which now look really grainy, and then you had some of the new ones. And so, yeah, what you learn about user experience will be beneficial. I think that when you transition from Power Platform to Dynamics, besides the difference in model versus Canvas, generally the data model becomes more complex. So that's where, again, you need to balance that. And you'll have some architects that are stronger in one or the other. And that's part of staffing projects, of knowing who'd be the right fit for that. But yeah, I think if I'm an architect, I'm going to be learning about UX best practices, learning about layout. And I think you'll find you'll see things you've been doing wrong, even within the constraints of the model driven app. But even remember, if you don't know how to do Canvas apps, Canvas pages are coming, these frameworks are getting closer together. So you need to learn this. And that's where I think you might still have some people on your staff who are UX experts and get them to review your design and do that. But as far as the general flow of how the app will work and how it works with the data model, how data integrates with it, if you got data coming in, that's straight down what the architect does.
I think we can have a whole episode about how do you guys see the usage of these technologies like Canvas and model driven, for example, because what I found is, for me at least, my best practice is to try to stay away from Canvas apps as much as possible, unless I'm doing something that is very one task oriented. Like if you are, let's say, a realtor and you're going to properties and, writing down how many bedrooms and bathrooms and square footage and taking pictures, that's your thing. That's all you do. Then I think a Canvas app is great for that. And obviously, if you're mobile, that contributes a lot to a Canvas app. But if I'm doing something that requires a more complex, like you, Joel, mentioned, data diagram and interaction, I think model driven is always my go-to. And the issue that I found is, some customers that get into Power Platform and love Canvas apps, and they are trying to solve every problem with a Canvas app. And because it becomes their solution, then it's kind of like, it doesn't matter how complex it gets, they always try to solve it with Canvas apps. So they write all this code. They're trying to make it work. Like, they're trying to justify it because, you don't want a boat that you build to sink. So you're trying to figure out a way to do it. And I've noticed in some projects that I've had some customers that say, I think we should use Canvas app for this, and, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it, or you guys go for it. And I'm like, I really don't think Canvas apps is the right solution for this one. So again, I think we can do a whole episode about what makes you go one direction versus another. I'm interested to hear about, do you have some rules that will kind of say this is Canvas all day, or this is model driven all day, or can I give you maybe some scenarios and see where you guys would go? Because I think some of them are, pretty close and you could solve with either,
I think it's a false argument. I think for many customers, the answer is both. And I'll tell you why. I will refer to you to Microsoft has had several COVID-related accelerators or solution examples. It's not the crisis communication; it's the other one, the response accelerator. It has a really good design pattern where they've got Canvas apps for the people at the facilities, counting the beds, counting the number of patients, their PPE equipment, those task-specific stuff. But then you need, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from one of my clients, you need the cockpit. You need the admin experience where you can enter in data quickly and view reports and view relationship dense information. That's that. So almost every Canvas app we've done has a corresponding admin model driven app. And so it's a really good fit, because if you send somebody like the Pepsi delivery guy out with model driven app, it's way overkill if they just need to keep taking inventory of what's at the store. Whereas if you try and use Canvas apps to build the full administrator suite, that's not geared towards that. So that's where understanding that, and especially I'm looking ahead 6 months to where they're not separate platforms so much as you have these controls that can be combined, you designing the right experience. So I would say, I wouldn't say it as bluntly as you did, Gus, but I would say that the answer usually isn't just Canvas apps.
Well, but I'm talking about separate personas, right? I think that when you think about the actual solution as a whole, so if I tell you, for example, hey, look, in our dynamic solution or Power, app solution, whatever we call it, we need the ability to track warranties. So when people buy devices from us, we need to give them the ability to track warranties, right? And so what is that? And you want your employees to do it, because I guess you could say, well, a Power Portal will do that, allowing people to go in and track the warranties. But imagine your own employees are going to do that. So, you can think about, if you think about just one persona, like the user actually entering the warranty information, do you give them a model driven or do you give them a Canvas? You're not going to use both for that one
No,
person. Now
but
you're
it would
right.
depends on what that user needs to do. If you are the
Exactly.
warranty administrator typing in all these warranties and associated with equipment, you would use model driven for that. If you are a guy in a field who needs to look up warranty information while you do a simple ticket or something, then can't use that.
Yes.
So it's the experience, it's what
It's the
people
persona.
do, it's what connectors do they need, it's what's the experience supposed to be like. And so you could have split personas though, because I can point to salespeople who are using the model driven app when they're doing their account planning, but then when they're on the go, they want quick notes and they're whipping out a Canvas app to update notes quickly. So I mean,
See, I told you this is a whole different episode. I
yeah,
told you we can talk about this for an hour. So
that's where as the architect you need to not be so wed to one or the other, so you can say this is the direction we should go.
right.
So one of the architectural principles I try and encourage my teams to adopt is not to mix things up too much. Let me give you an example. If I need to do some form customization in a model app, I could probably use business rules for a lot of it, but you're going to run up to some requirement that can't be met with a business rule, and you might need to fall back to JavaScript. At that stage, I'd rather just do everything in JavaScript, because support enhancements later on, somebody's going to have to figure out what's causing this UI customization. Tear apart all the business rules. No, it's not in there. Hold on, there's a JS file. And then we tear into that as well and try and find where I need to make a change. That's really tough if you're using a combination of techniques. Same for, should we use Flow or Power Automate or classic workflows? We'll try and stick with one or the other. Should we use Flow or Logic Apps? Try and stick with one or the other. Try not to use a combination of both, or be very clear about when you've used one versus the other, because it just makes support and maintenance much more challenging later on. Any thoughts on that?
But what you're talking about is to complete a specific task, right? Not to mix them up if you're completing a specific task. Like the customization's in one form, but when you think about the whole solution, you can't just do everything with just Flow, or you can't do everything with just workflows. You may need one or the other in the entirety of the solution. So if you're trying to accomplish something, like let's say when we win an opportunity, a project should be created automatically and it should be assigned to the right, project manager based on the state where they're located or the region. You don't want that specific thing to rely on Flow and workflows and a bunch of different combination of things. Like I get it that the best practice would be, let's just pick one, whatever meets the requirement, and let's use Flow to do that, or let's use workflows to do that. Don't mix and match. But I think that doing it in a bigger scale, it's tough. I don't know how you would be able to stick to one or the other.
Yeah,
I think that's what you meant.
I would agree in principle within a tight area of the application. So for example, JavaScript versus business rules. If we have an opportunity form that needs a lot of automation around, if it's this type, automatically associate this product with it and XYZ, I wouldn't mix business rules and JavaScript on the same form. But if we have a simple show hide on the task form, I'm not saying that needs to be JavaScript because over here we use JavaScript. I would say if it is clear, where it is, and that might be a good case for documentation. Any place we use a plugin should have some kind of source code in the documentation, high level with that.
But I agree with you, Neil, that if you're hiding and showing tabs, for example, which you can do with business rules, you don't want to use business rules for fields, right? I mean, if you're gonna write a bunch of JavaScript to do tabs, just do fields too,
On the Flow topic, you also need to consider things like licensing and API calls and a number of different things that go into that, because the reality is I get a pretty big bucket of Flow executions part of my Dynamics licensing, where logic apps you have to pay per. So then also simpler rules. Logic apps generally need more of a developer to do, even though they share a lot of commonalities. And so, I would say I have mixed logic apps and flows within the same environment because, again, we didn't want to have to pay an additional cost for each process. And also because certain things we wanted to be more approachable from people who are closer to citizen developers than the developers. So that's where, again, I would take that into. But as a general rule, I'll give you an example. SLAs being associated with cases. There's the out of the box one where you can have the condition on the SLA, but then you can also, if you need more advanced, you can use workflows to associate SLAs with that,
That's right.
or routing rules. And I've seen environments that mix that together, that some of the SLAs are set via workflow, some of the SLAs are set automatically, and it's impossible to work that out. So I agree with coming up with a standard approach for, this is how we're going to do it. This is how routing rules too, and that's where I try and consolidate that. So, I'll see a junior consultant create a workflow that will do things that you could do with a routing rule, where I won't put that in the workflow. I'll do up to that point and then know that the routing rule is automatic, because I want the customer service manager, to be able to tweak that rule without having to go edit the flow or the workflow. So I'm thinking ahead of, how are the users going to administer this? How, when I'm gone, or somebody else is involved here, is this going to stay together? Because I'll see junior consultants or junior architects do things that work, but they don't scale, and they aren't sustainable.
So Neil, when you have, let's say, we're talking about this JavaScript thing, you have 10 things that should happen in a form, and 9 of them are achievable with a business rule. Is your first thought to, let's just write JavaScript for all 10, or is it, let me talk this guy out of that number 10 that will mess it up for me, so I can just do business rules and call it a day?
So there's a couple of considerations, and Joel's alluded to the first one, which is, who's going to look after this? Does my customer have lots of developers in the IT shop that are going to be looking after this application, or is it non-developer personas? Is it a system administrator or a sales operations analyst, or somebody who just doesn't have the JavaScript skills, right? So in my current scenario, there's a lot of developers around in my team and in the customer's IT department. So we're not afraid to use lots of JavaScript. And so we will tend to say, look, let's use JavaScript for all the UI customization. To Joel's point, we'll sometimes find a simple entity that really only has a couple of requirements, and a business rule might be fine for it. But we try not to mix business rules and JavaScript on the same form or the same entity.
Because they'll conflict with each other. You don't know what order they'll run in.
That's right. So that might mean we started out with business rules, and now we need to take the business rules and rewrite them as JavaScript, so we can control the execution order and the sequence and have everything in one place. So we incur a little bit of technical debt if we need to revisit that decision for a given entity. We're at the point right now where let's just use JavaScript for all the UI customization, because 90% of our UI customization is in JavaScript, and we've got patterns, we've got libraries, and we've got the skills. So let's just do it.
Yeah, interesting approach.
I always want to make sure people understand, the long-term costs of their choices. And if they have something, because we've all seen people do really over-engineered field forms where everything's moving around based on all kinds of things. Most of the time they come back 5 years later and rip that out, because it irritates people. It makes the form load longer. So, I think talking them out of it is a good choice, but it comes a point where they say, no, we need this. But I've done a number of configurations, or a number of my project configurations that have very little form automation. We're using background like flows or real-time workflows when we need things to happen. But I'm just not a fan of a lot of over excessive, automatically make this move here, do that, because it just carries a debt with it. And the
Yeah.
cleaner you can be, the faster your form will load.
Absolutely. So how do you guys deal with, and you can stop me if this is not super related to what we're talking about, but how do you deal, because you just mentioned this, Joel, it says, unless the customer comes in and says, we absolutely need this. How do you deal when the customer says, we absolutely need this, but it's not right for them, or it's going to be useless, or they shouldn't get it because it's going to destroy performance, or whatever it is? You, as an architect, so you have the technical background, know that that's not the right move for them. But the customer here comes and says, we absolutely need this thing. How do you deal with those situations?
The decision log can help, because you can document, Neil Benson's recommendation and then customer decision, so you can have something to point back to. And there's
But so you do it even though it's the wrong thing, as long as you can document it?
well, I mean, if depends on what it is. I mean, if I don't think it's a good idea, but it's not going to blow anything up. Yeah, I would do it. If it's going to be an unsupported thing that'll break or something, no, I wouldn't do it. But most of the times it's not that extreme. It's usually I don't really like that approach to lead management. But you know what? If that's what you want, we got budget for it, and it's not going to blow up. It might not be as good as I think it could be. I'll go ahead and do it if we go through, I make my opinion known and I document my recommendation and they say, no, we need it to do that way. Yeah, I would do it if it's not going to break something.
Interesting.
I'll give you a couple of examples, Gus. 10 years ago, I was
Yeah.
working for a private equity fund manager called Collar Capital, and their corporate colors were two different shades of green. And they wanted this CRM application to look like their SharePoint website, which was green. So this is CRM 3.0, I think, back in the day. So we had to hack this CSS to make it look green. I was like, this is an unsupported customization. Please sign this get out of jail free card because I will need this someday when you come back and you raise a support case because it's no longer green. And so they forced us to do it. They paid us to do it. They were happy that it was unsupported and they took the risk. No problem. More recently, and this is a little tiny one, but a user wanted to record the type of vulnerability that a customer has, like a financial hardship or a physical disability or something. She wanted a checkbox. When you check the checkbox, the list of potential vulnerabilities would appear. Like, no, we just have the option set. That's it. And if there's a value in the option set, then the person has a vulnerability. That's it. You don't need a checkbox and an option set to record one thing. Like you don't have a checkbox saying first name. Yep, they have a first name, and then show the first name field. We're not having too many checkboxes. Get rid of it.
But I think sometimes we can have a what do you call the thing where you don't see reality? I'm trying to think of what it does. They always accuse Steve Jobs of having the distortion field, the reality distortion field.
Yeah.
And in if your job is just deploying Dynamics or business applications and you're not an active user of it, you need to be able to put yourselves in the user's shoes, because I have had cases where I have a quote unquote best practice. Anybody who tells you their best practices are lying. Best practices are basically my opinion and what I think is good. Whether it's good or not, it's just what my thing to do. But I've had things where I had best practices that once I took my reality distortion field down and actually sat down in the call center and watched how they worked, I realized why they were asking it. And then I become a little bit more flexible on those things, because yeah, sure, from a data model, it might be cleaner to do it one way. That's where, again, I hear a lot of people kind of scoff at the multi-select option set, because they think, oh, it's not as, if I'm doing a report, I like it to be a clean, like a many-to-many relationship. But you got to understand, from a user perspective, if I can see all the values in one field and show it on a view, that is huge. And so I need to be a little bit more flexible, still tell them, here's the potential downside to it. But when it comes to, if they're paying me to do it and it's legal and it's not going to break anything, then I'm going to do it.
Interesting. I feel like I have a lot less chill than you guys when it comes to being a solution architect, because the one thing that I like to do when I start projects is I tell them, look, I'm going to do whatever you guys ask me to do, as long as it meets one condition, which is you need to explain to me how whatever you're asking will help the company get better at acquiring companies or acquiring business, get better at delivering the products they buy from us, or get better at keeping them as customers. If your request does not meet at least one of those three things, we're not going to do it. Like, that is the only rule. And man, since I've been doing this thing, since essentially I started the company back in 2014, I rarely get weird requests like they just want to do something because we need to get it. And I think because the customer agrees upfront to the rule, saying like, that makes total sense, we're not going to add complexity to a system just for the sake of adding complexity. It needs to have a business value associated with it. Every single customer signs up on that. So when someone comes in and says, I want to have the SharePoint documents right in the form. I don't want to have to click on another tab. I don't want to click on related and go to documents. I want it right here. Make it happen. Then I just ask, okay, how is that going to help us get more customers? How's that going to help us?
Now what you say is good news. We have a file attribute type.
Right. Exactly. It's full circle, right? Back to the file attribute type. But I'm just saying there are some requests like that.
Is your point going to help them do that better than their point?
I don't know. What do you mean?
Well, like if they're arguing that they want to have, you know, do something to make the process flow automatically go to the next step when this happens, you know, arguably by having more people adopt the system, they'll be closer to getting that goal met. And if that's going to, and it's part of its industries you work with. Financial services are legendary for being overpaid babies that need to have, things do everything for them automatically, or
Sure.
they just won't use the system.
No, but I think you can make I think you can make a case on the example that you provided and said, look, we want this automation of the business process flow because one thing that we've noticed in the past is that people don't click to the next stage, and then the timing and capturing the timing we spend in every stage is all messed up, and we're unable to detect bottlenecks, and customers get unhappy because we have bottlenecks. I get it. That is a direct relationship between that piece of functionality and business, and that makes total sense. But there are some requests that are just straight up will cause zero difference in the business results of the company and what my solution will do. So for me, the most effective solution is any solution that all its moving parts are going to help the company get better at one of those three things, or hopefully
Right.
more than one of those three things. Anything else
Right.
beyond that is just noise, is causing performance issues, more complexity, more things to maintain, more things that can break after an upgrade. So I try to avoid all those things.
Well, I'll give you an example, and I think there's certain types of deployments where people have to use the system. So a call center, that's the system you track the cases in. You have to use the system. Whereas if you are certain types of salespeople or certain in insurance, certain agents, if they're successful, they're not going to get fired for not using the system. And you need to have adoption to have a successful deployment to drive the goals to justify spending the money in the system. So one I had recently was generating a document. We were using Flow because we were creating it to a PDF, and user feedback was clicking the flow button to run the on selected record flow. It was slow,
It is.
and B, it was confusing to them because they didn't understand. Okay, I want to get the account application form. Why am I clicking a button that says flow? So we elected to create a button that would call a process because it was it was viewed as critical for adoption of the system, because otherwise they had alternate ways they could get the old paper form out and use that, and it was viewed as critical enough that some people would do that. So arguably, that's something where other things that are, you know, especially if we're out of time or budget and it's the end and it's something that isn't going to impact it. Yeah, well, I would say, yeah, you need to use common sense. But you need to put yourself, as an architect at times, I have made, you start answering the question before you hear the question asked. That's when it's a warning sign that, you're maybe a little bit too important in your mind, and you need to put yourselves in their shoes and really think through. And then at least when you say no, you can say it in an empathetic manner, and maybe give them an alternative suggestion that, well, it's not exactly what they want. It gets close to understanding the root of why they're asking for that, which might not be that whole automation thing. It might not really be automation. It might be, it takes too many dang clicks to get to here. So let's find another way to, maybe we cut one of the stages out or make it a branching flow so you don't see all four stages, you see two, unless it's a certain type. There's other ways to get there, but it's understanding where they are and then being able to empathetically say, here's what I suggest.
Because I agree with you to a certain extent, but I can bringing it back to the agile approach, which was the reason I dragged you onto the call in the first place. And we'll wrap up in a second. Determining what the value is from that feature is, to me, the product owner's job. And the solution architect should present some options, should question the value that the organization is going to get from that user story being satisfied. But if the product owner tells me that's what we're going to have and here's the value from it, then I'll take that and I'll implement it. We'll have that debate, certainly, but it's their decision at the end of the day. And maybe I rely less on my solution architect to carry that burden, and I put that burden back on the product.
And let's be honest. Sometimes it's architect laziness. I've already put a lot of work in this. I'm sick of this feature. I want to move on, and so I don't want to do this, even though we got time and budget. I want to be done with this. So this is the best practice. Let's move on.
This is a,
That's
yeah,
where,
this is a MVP best practice, right? You throw that in there.
Yeah.
Oh, Gus and Joel, it's been fantastic catching up with you. Thanks very much for jumping on this call and helping me think through some of the, my thoughts related to architects on Agile projects and all the other discussion we had. It went in lots of different directions. That was awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.